Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. The day was already a mess, the kind of dusk that hangs heavy over the prairie like a damp blanket when everything went to hell. Travis Boone was out in his old barn, a rickety thing with walls so weathered you could see slivers of the fading orange sky through the cracks. He was 34, wiry from years of ranch work, but his eyes, they carried something heavier, lines carved deep from burying his wife just 2 days back. He'd been out there alone, tossing shovelfuls of dirt to patch up a fence line when the wind kicked up, howling like a wounded animal through the splintered planks. It was the kind of sound that made your skin prickle, but Travis barely noticed. He was lost in his own head, replaying the way the preacher's voice had cracked at the graveside. Then it hit. This shrill, piercing whine cut through the air, blasting from the dented little radio he kept perched on a hay bale. The thing was ancient, its antenna bent from when he'd kicked it in a fit last summer, but it still worked enough to catch the local station. "Emergency alert! Zombies rising! Stay indoors! Help is coming!" The voice crackled, flat and mechanical, like it didn't believe its own words. Travis froze mid-shovel, the blade sinking into the dirt as his heart slammed up into his throat. He turned toward the radio, squinting at it like it might explain itself, but all he got was static hissing back at him. "Zombies?" he muttered under his breath, voice rough from disuse. "What kind of bullshit is this?" He stepped closer, wiping sweat off his brow with the back of his hand, when the wind carried something else, a sound that wasn't natural. Out past the muddy field stretching beyond the barn, there was this low, guttural chorus of shrieks, sharp enough to slice through the thick fog rolling in. Travis dropped the shovel, letting it clang against a rusted pitchfork, and grabbed the shotgun leaning against the wall. He'd kept it loaded since the coyotes got bold last winter, and now his fingers tightened around the grip, calluses brushing the cold metal. He swung around, peering out through a gap in the planks, and that's when he saw it. Pure chaos breaking loose in the twilight. The storm from last night had been a monster, tearing across the prairie like it had a personal grudge. It ripped trees up by their roots, flooded the ditches, and apparently split the damn ground wide open. Out there, where the old cemetery hugged the edge of his land, the earth was cracked like a busted windshield, and things were crawling out. Not people, not anymore. These were gaunt, skeletal figures, caked in mud, their hands clawing at the air like they were trying to climb out of a nightmare. Their shrieks echoed, high and jagged, bouncing off the fog as they staggered upright. Travis's stomach churned when he spotted one of them, a bony, rotten thing with strings of hair dangling from its scalp, lurched toward one of his calves. The poor animal didn't stand a chance. The zombie tackled it, claws sinking into its hide, and with one wet, ripping sound, guts spilled out in a steaming heap, blood soaking into the cracked dirt like some kind of sick painting. "Jesus Christ," Travis breathed, stepping back, his boot crunching an old nail into the floorboards. He was still processing, heart thudding loud enough to drown out the wind, when the barn door exploded inward with a splintering crash. He swung the shotgun up, finger twitching on the trigger, as two figures stumbled inside. First came Holly Reed, 28, a waitress from the diner in town. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and her face was streaked with blood and dirt, like she'd run through a slaughterhouse. She was dragging her kid brother, Caleb, behind her. He was 13, all wiry limbs and wide eyes that didn't blink, just stared ahead like he'd seen the devil himself. Holly's chest heaved as she gasped. "They tore my pa apart!" Her voice cracked, raw and desperate, and Travis saw the butcher knife in her hand, its blade slick with red dripping onto the hay-strewn floor with soft little plops. Before he could even get a word out, headlights sliced through the mist outside, blinding him for a second as they bounced off the barn's warped walls. A truck engine roared, gravel spitting under tires, and then Earl Buck Grayson burst into the scene. Buck was 50, a grizzled old trucker with a beard that looked like it'd been growing since the Nixon days, and he was hauling ass out of his rig with a revolver clenched in his meaty fist. "Town's a damn slaughterhouse!" he bellowed, his voice booming over the wind as he slammed the driver's door shut. His boots thudded heavy on the ground, kicking up clumps of mud as he charged toward the barn, his wild eyes catching the dim light from Travis's lantern. "Get that door shut!" Travis barked, snapping out of his daze. He lunged forward, shoulder slamming into the splintered wood as he and Holly shoved it back into place. Buck threw his weight in too, grunting as they dragged an old feed crate over, its edges scraping the floor with a gritty screech. Caleb just stood there, fists balled at his sides, staring at the ground where Holly's knife had left a smear of blood. The air inside was thick now, smelling of damp wood, sweat, and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or the coppery tang of whatever Holly had been fighting. They'd barely gotten the crate wedged tight when something smashed into the window on the far wall. Glass shattered inward, shards tinkling across the floor, and a zombie's head shoved through, its jaw unhinged, gaping wide, showing teeth jagged and yellowed like old corn. Travis didn't think, just swung the shotgun around and squeezed the trigger. The boom rattled the barn, a deep, hollow sound that made his ears ring, and the zombie's head burst like a rotten melon. Gore sprayed out, thick and wet, splattering across Caleb's legs. The kid flinched, just barely, his sneakers squeaking as he shifted back, but he didn't say a word, just kept staring, like he was somewhere else entirely. "Holy shit," Buck muttered, wiping his brow with a shaky hand, his revolver still raised like he was waiting for round two. And round two came fast. The floorboards under their feet groaned, then buckled, and another one of those things clawed its way up from the dirt below. Its fingers, gnarled, black-nailed, scraped at the wood, splintering it as it hauled itself up, letting out a howl that sounded like a dying dog. Holly moved like lightning, shoving Caleb behind her and driving her butcher knife down hard. The blade sank into its skull with a sickening crunch, black blood gushing out in a hot, stinking rush that pooled around her boots. The thing's howl choked off into a gurgle, its body twitching once before going limp, and the barn shook under the force of the wind screaming outside, like it was mocking them. Travis steadied himself against the wall, shotgun still smoking, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Holly yanked her knife free with a wet squelch, her hands trembling as she wiped it on her jeans, leaving a dark smear. Buck kicked the crate tighter against the door, his boots thudding dully, and growled, "We ain't staying here long. This place is a coffin waiting to happen." Outside, the shrieks were getting louder, closer, cutting through the fog like knives, and Travis knew Buck was right. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't stopping, and it sure as hell wasn't waiting for them to catch their breath. Travis stood there in the barn, chest still heaving from the last shot, the shotgun barrel warm against his palm. The air was thick with that sour stench of rot and gunpowder, and the wind kept rattling the walls like it was trying to tear the place down itself. He stepped over to the radio, its dented casing glinting faintly under the lantern light, and twisted the dial hard, knuckles whitening. Static hissed out, loud and jagged, looping that same damn message. "Emergency alert. Zombies rising. Stay indoors. Help is coming." He snorted, a rough, bitter sound, and muttered, "Yeah, right. Help's coming. Same way it came for Sarah." His wife's name slipped out before he could stop it, and he clenched his jaw, shaking his head like he could shove the memory back down. Holly was over by the hay bales, crouched low, her boots scuffing the floor as she wiped that butcher knife on her sleeve. The blood left a dark, wet streak on the denim, and her hands shook bad. Little tremors she tried to hide by gripping the handle tighter. She glanced over at Caleb, who was slumped against the wall, knees pulled up, fists balled tight in his lap like he was holding on to something invisible. His face was pale, those big eyes of his locked on nothing, just staring through the cracked planks like he could see straight into whatever hell was waiting outside. "You okay, kid?" Holly asked, voice soft but frayed, reaching out to brush his tangled hair back. He didn't flinch, didn't answer, just kept staring, and that silence hit her harder than any scream could have. Buck was pacing near the door, heavy boots thudding on the wood, his breath coming out in short, growly huffs. He kept one hand clamped over his arm, fingers digging into the sleeve of his jacket where that floor zombie had raked him. Travis caught a glimpse. Under the torn fabric, a deep scratch was oozing, dark and slick, the skin around it looking raw and pissed off. Buck saw him looking and yanked the sleeve down, snarling, We roll or we rot, Boone. Ain't no time for standing around. He flexed his hand, wincing a little, but squared his shoulders like he could will the pain away. Travis didn't push it. Buck was a tough old bastard, and they didn't have time to play doctor anyway. Grain Depot's our best shot, Travis said, jerking his chin toward the door. It's got walls, thick ones, maybe a chance to breathe. He slung the shotgun over his shoulder, the strap digging into his neck, and grabbed a rusted tire iron from a pile of tools by the wall, hefting it in his free hand. Holly nodded quick, shoving her knife into her belt, but when she tugged Caleb to his feet, those blank eyes of his drilled into her, unblinking, cold, like he was sizing her up. She swallowed hard, forcing a shaky smile. Come on, bud. We're getting out of here. He moved with her, slow and mechanical, his sneakers dragging through the hay. They piled into Buck's rig outside, the truck's engine coughing to life with a deep, throaty rumble that shook the ground under their feet. Travis climbed into the passenger seat, shotgun across his lap, while Holly squeezed into the back with Caleb, her arm slung protective around his shoulders. Buck gunned it, tires spinning in the mud for a second before catching, churning up thick, wet clumps that splattered the sides of the cab. The fog was so dense now you could barely see 10 feet ahead, just a swirling gray shroud swallowing the fields. But Buck didn't slow down, his knuckles white on the wheel as he growled, "Hold on tight, folks. This ain't a Sunday drive." The truck roared through the prairie, bouncing hard over ruts and flooded patches, the chassis creaking like it might snap in half. Out of nowhere, shapes started lurching up from the ditches. Zombies, their bony frames slick with mud and water, surging toward the road. One slammed into the windshield right in front of Travis, its skull cracking the glass with a spiderweb of lines. Its teeth snapped inches from his face, yellowed and jagged, spit flecking the cracked pane. "Shit!" Travis yelled, fumbling the tire iron up and jamming it forward. The metal punched through its eye with a wet pop, blood flooding out in a hot rush that smeared the dash and dripped onto his jeans. He yanked the iron back, the zombie sliding off with a gurgling wheeze, tumbling under the truck's wheels. Another one leapt onto the cab from the side, claws scraping at Buck's window with a nails-on-chalkboard screech. Buck cursed loud, swerving the wheel, but it hung on, its head banging against the glass. Holly lunged forward, knife flashing as she slashed across its neck. The blade bit deep, and its head flopped sideways, dangling by a shred of skin before the truck's momentum ripped it free. It hit the ground with a wet crunch, tires rolling right over it, and Buck let out a hoarse laugh. "That's how you do it, girl," he shouted, but the grin faded fast when a whole pack of them swarmed the road ahead, red eyes blazing through the fog like little hellfires. "Floor it!" Travis barked, gripping the dash as Buck slammed the gas. The truck plowed through, bodies bursting under the grill in sprays of gore, limbs cracking, guts splattering up onto the hood with sick, meaty thuds. One of them latched onto the roof, though, its claws punching through the metal with a screech that made Travis's teeth ache. He twisted in his seat, shotgun up, and fired blind through the ceiling. The blast roared in the tight space, deafening, and a hole ripped open above them. Black blood rained down, warm and sticky, soaking his hair, dripping into Holly's lap, splattering Caleb's face. The kid didn't even blink, just sat there, staring up at the jagged hole as the zombie's body slid off, thumping somewhere behind them. Travis shook the blood out of his eyes, spitting to clear his mouth, and squinted ahead. Through the fog, the grain depot started to take shape, rusted silos hulking against the sky, their outlines blurry but solid. "There," he shouted, pointing, voice raw. Buck nodded, jaw tight, and gunned the engine harder, the truck rattling like it was about to shake itself apart. The shrieks were still out there, echoing in the haze, but the depot was close now. Maybe close enough to make it. Maybe. The truck fishtailed hard as Buck yanked the wheel, tires screeching across the muddy gravel until they slid to a stop outside the grain depot. The place was a hulking shadow in the haze, rusted silos towering up, their sides streaked with reddish-brown stains that could have been old weather or something worse. Loose tin panels clattered in the wind, a sharp, uneven banging that sounded like someone tapping out a warning. Travis didn't wait for the engine to settle. He kicked his door open with a grunt, the metal groaning as it swung wide, and hopped out, boots sinking an inch into the soggy ground. Shotgun still in hand, he scanned the yard, the fog so thick it felt like it was pressing against his chest. A figure stepped out from behind one of the silos, moving slow but deliberate. It was Pastor Ruth Cole, 42, wiry as a fence post, her muddy boots leaving little smears on the concrete slab she stood on. She gripped a crowbar tight, its curved end glinting dully in the dim light, and her preacher's collar peeked out from under a worn coat. "God's refuge is here," she said, her voice steady as a rock but low, like she didn't want to wake something up. Her eyes darted quick, left, right, then back to them, taking in the blood on their clothes, the wild look in their faces. Travis nodded sharp, not in the mood for sermons, and waved the others out. "Move it!" he barked, voice cutting through the wind. Holly stumbled out of the cab, dragging Caleb behind her, his skinny frame swaying a little as she pulled him along. Buck climbed down heavy, his boots thudding hard, and slammed the truck door shut with a clang that echoed off the silos. They hustled toward the depot's main entrance, a big double-wide door half off its hinges, and Ruth led the way, her steps quick and sure like she'd done this drill before. Inside, the air hit them like a slap, damp and sour, stinking of rot so bad Travis had to swallow to keep his stomach down. They shoved the doors shut behind them, the wood scraping rough against the frame, and started piling up anything they could find. Old grain crates, a busted chair, even a dented metal barrel that rolled with a hollow rumble as Buck kicked it into place. Travis stepped back, wiping sweat off his forehead with his sleeve, and took a look around. The depot was a cavernous mess, high ceilings lost in shadows, walls streaked with bloody handprints that trailed off into smeared lines like someone had been dragged. Over in the corner, a child's muddy shoe sat crushed flat, laces tangled in a little knot, and it made his gut twist. He glanced at Holly, who was brushing Caleb's hair back again, her fingers lingering like she was checking he was still real. The kid muttered something under his breath. So quiet, Travis almost missed it. "It's wrong." His voice was flat, dead, like he was reading off a script, and it sent a cold shiver racing up Holly's spine. She froze, hand hovering over his shoulder, then forced a tight, "What's wrong, bud?" He didn't answer, just stared at the shoe, unblinking. Buck was over by the crates, flexing his scratched arm like he was testing it. The sleeve rode up a bit, and Travis caught sight of it, black veins snaking out from the gash, creeping under his skin like spilled ink. Buck's hand shook just a little, but he caught Travis staring and growled, "I ain't weak, Boone. Don't you look at me like that." He shoved Travis hard, a meaty palm slamming into his chest, rocking him back a step. Travis steadied himself, jaw tight, but didn't swing back. Buck's eyes were wild, too wild, and that scratch was looking worse by the second. Holly's fingers tightened around her knife, sliding it out of her belt, slow, her breath hitching as she watched them. Before anyone could say more, a crash exploded from above, a heavy, splintering thud that shook dust loose from the rafters. Up on the roof, something was moving, clawing at the vents with a shrill, scraping sound that set Travis's teeth on edge. Then one of them dropped through, a zombie, all wiry limbs and snapping jaws, landing square on Ruth with a wet smack. She didn't scream, just swung that crowbar like she was splitting firewood. It cracked into the thing's skull, blood spraying out in a hot arc that splashed across her chest, staining her coat dark. The zombie crumpled, twitching, but Ruth barely had time to catch her breath before Buck let out a roar, deep, guttural, not human. His eyes flared red, bright as brake lights, and he lunged at her, teeth sinking into her neck with a sick, ripping sound. Blood poured down her shoulder, soaking into the concrete, and she gasped, crowbar clattering to the floor. Holly moved fast, knife flashing as she swung hard, cleaving into Buck's skull with a wet crunch that split it wide. Gore gushed out, a thick, black-red mess that splashed across the crates and puddled under her boots. Buck dropped like a sack of feed, his body jerking once before going still, but the depot wasn't done with them yet. The floor shook, boards cracking as more of those things clawed up from below. Flooded tunnels must have run under the place, and now they were bursting through. Their claws raked the wood, splintering it into jagged chunks, and Travis fired quick. 2 shots, boom boom, dropping a pair of them. Their bodies hit the ground twitching, black blood pooling around them. But Ruth was staggering now, her gasps turning into snarls, her neck wound bubbling dark. "Go!" Travis yelled, shoving Holly toward a siloed chute in the back, a narrow, rusted tunnel of steel bolted to the wall. She grabbed Caleb, half dragging him as he shuffled along, that blank stare still locked on nothing. They bolted, feet pounding the concrete, the horde's howls bouncing off the metal walls like a twisted choir. Ruth's snarls mixed in, sharp and feral, and as Travis glanced back, he saw her eyes glowing red, her hands clawing at the air. The chute was tight, the air inside cold and stale, and somewhere in the chaos a faint sound cut through, a child's cry, soft and lost, echoing from somewhere deeper in the depot. It prickled the back of his neck, but there was no time to think. They kept moving, the steel rattling under their weight, the zombies' shrieks chasing them into the dark. The chute was a tight, shaky mess, its rusted walls rattling under their boots like it might collapse any second. Fog seeped in through the seams, cold and damp, curling around them as they scrambled forward. Travis was up front, the shotgun slung over his back, while he fumbled with a dented gas can he'd yanked from a shelf back in the depot. His hands were slick with sweat, fingers trembling as he twisted a rag into a makeshift fuse, the sharp smell of gasoline stinging his nose. Behind him, Holly had Caleb pulled close, her arm locked around his skinny shoulders. The kid was still as a statue, his silence digging into her like a splinter she couldn't pull out. She kept glancing at him, her breath catching every time his blank stare met hers. Ruth was slumped against the chute's wall, her coat soaked dark with blood that pooled under her, dripping slow and steady onto the steel with a faint tap, tap, tap. Her chest heaved, each breath a wet rasp, and when she spoke, her voice was rough like gravel grinding together. "They're drawn to noise, something alive," she managed, her head lolling to the side. Travis looked back, and his stomach dropped. Her eyes were glowing red now, bright and unnatural, cutting through the dimness like warning lights. He swung the shotgun around, finger hovering over the trigger, but before he could decide, something else stopped him cold. Holly shifted, tugging Caleb closer, and his jacket snagged on a jagged bolt sticking out of the chute. The fabric tore with a soft rip, and there it was, a bite mark on his arm, crusted over with black, scabby edges, the skin around it bruised and wrong. It wasn't fresh. This was old, maybe from yesterday when the storm hit and everything went to hell. Holly had brushed it off then, bandaged it with a rag from her diner apron, figuring he'd scraped it on a fence or something. Now, staring at it, she choked out a strangled, "No," and stumbled back, her boots slipping on the slick metal. Caleb didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared at her, unblinking, his breath coming out in a low, hissing sound that made the hair on Travis's neck stand up. Ruth moved then, fast and jerky, lunging at Travis with her teeth snapping inches from his face. He fired without thinking, the shotgun's roar deafening in the tight space. Her chest burst open, blood spraying out in a hot, sticky wave that soaked the chute's walls and splashed across his hands. She crumpled, a gurgling snarl fading as she hit the floor, but the chute wasn't done shaking. The steel groaned, and then the bottom ripped apart. Zombies clawed up from below, their bony hands punching through like they'd been waiting down there in the dark. One of them latched onto Holly, pinning her against the wall with a thud that knocked the wind out of her. Its claws raked her arm, tearing through her sleeve and slicing skin, but she twisted hard, jamming her knife up into its eye. The blade sank in with a wet squish, gore pouring out over her hand as the thing's claw twitched and fell limp. She kicked it off, gasping, just as another one grabbed Caleb, its nails digging into his chest, shredding his shirt. He didn't scream, didn't even flinch, just watched it happen, those dead eyes locked on nothing while blood welled up, dark and thick. Travis swung around, blasting the thing point blank with the shotgun. Black blood splattered across his face, warm and bitter, stinging his eyes as the zombie dropped, twitching in a heap. "He's turning!" Travis yelled, voice raw, yanking the revolver from his belt and leveling it at Caleb. The kid's breath was louder now, a growling hiss, his fingers curling like he didn't know they were his anymore. Holly's face crumpled, and she tackled Travis hard, slamming him into the wall with a sob that tore out of her. "He's mine!" she screamed, her fists pounding his chest, tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. Travis shoved her back, not hard, just enough to get space, but there was no time to argue. The gas can's fuse was spitting sparks, and he dropped it when she hit him. The flame caught, a bright whoosh lighting up the chute, and then the whole thing exploded. The blast roared through the steel, heat searing their skin as the walls buckled and split. They tumbled out, thrown into the fog outside like rag dolls, landing hard in the muddy field. Travis hit first, rolling through the wet grass, his shoulders slamming into a rock that knocked the breath out of him. Holly landed a few feet away, coughing as she dragged herself up, her arm bleeding steady now, soaking her sleeve. Caleb was there too, sprawled in the dirt, his growl a low rumble in the haze, those red eyes flickering as he pushed himself to his knees. The zombies were still shrieking, their howls cutting through the fog, and the wind carried something else. A faint, childlike wail, soft and eerie, drifting from somewhere out in the dark. Travis scrambled to his feet, revolver still in hand, wiping blood and sweat from his face with his sleeve. Holly was staring at Caleb, her knife trembling in her grip, tears spilling down as she whispered, "Come on, bud, stay with me." But he didn't answer, just growled louder, a shadow moving closer through the mist, and Travis knew they weren't out of this yet. Travis stumbled through the fog, his boots sinking into the muddy field with every step, the revolver heavy in his hand. Holly was right behind him, half dragging Caleb, her arm hooked under his, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The kid's growl was low now, a steady rumble that vibrated through the haze, and it made Travis's skin crawl. They didn't stop moving, not with those zombie shrieks echoing behind them, until they hit a rotting feed shed, a sagging, pitiful thing half swallowed by the storm's mud. The walls were buckling, wood splintered and dark with rot, but it was something, anything, to put between them and whatever was out there. Travis shoved the door open, the hinges squealing like a kicked cat, and waved Holly in quick. She staggered inside, Caleb's weight pulling her off balance, and Travis followed, kicking the door shut with a dull thud. He grabbed a workbench from the corner, old, splintered, covered in cobwebs, and jammed it against the door, his shoulder aching as he leaned into it. The wood cracked under his hands, groaning as fists pounded the other side, a relentless thumping that rattled the whole shed. He stepped back, wiping mud off his face with a shaky hand, and turned to Holly, who was crouched in the middle of the dirt floor, clutching Caleb like he might vanish if she let go. The kid's chest wound was a mess, black ooze seeping through his torn shirt, thick and slow, like tar bubbling up from the ground. His growl deepened, rolling out of him in waves, and his head tilted slow, those blank eyes locking on nothing. Travis's voice came out rough, scraped raw from shouting and smoke. "When?" he demanded, stepping closer, the revolver still gripped tight. Holly's face crumpled, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks as she sobbed. "Yesterday. He tripped in the storm. I thought it was nothing." Her words spilled out fast, tripping over each other. "He fell near the ditch, scraped his arm. I bandaged it with my apron, told him to shake it off. I didn't look close, Travis. I didn't see." Her knife trembled in her hand, the blade catching the faint light filtering through the shed's cracked walls, and she stared at it like she didn't know what it was for anymore. Travis opened his mouth to say something, anything, but a shriek sliced through the fog outside, sharp and close, cutting him off. He spun toward the sound, peering through a gap in the wall, and saw her, a woman stumbling out of the fields, her dress tattered, hair hanging in wet clumps. She was alive for a heartbeat, staggering toward the shed, then stopped dead, clutching her side where something dark stained her dress. Her head jerked back, flesh peeling slow as red eyes blazed, turning her into one of them. Travis didn't hesitate. He fired through the gap, the revolver's crack echoing in the tight space. The shot took her in the chest, and she dropped hard, a crumpled heap in the mud, but the shed shuddered like it felt the hit. The floor buckled under their feet, a low groan rising before it split open, zombies clawing up from the muddy ground below, their hands bursting through with a wet, tearing sound. One erupted right under Holly, its claws slashing her leg as it hauled itself up. She yelped, pain flashing across her face, and swung her knife down hard, slicing its throat open. Blood sprayed out, hot and black, splattering across Caleb's chest as the thing collapsed, gurgling. Holly kicked it away, her leg bleeding now, a dark stain spreading down her jeans, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Caleb staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunk, black veins pulsing up his neck and across his face, webbing under his skin like cracks in glass. His growl was louder, sharper, and Travis roared, "He's gone." He raised the revolver, aiming square at the kid's chest, his finger tight on the trigger. Holly shrieked, "No," and lunged at him, swinging wild with her knife, not to cut, just to push him off. The blade nicked his arm, a shallow sting, and he stumbled back, cursing under his breath. "Holly, damn it, look at him," he yelled, but she was past hearing, tears streaming as she threw herself between them. Caleb moved then, fast, too fast, lunging at Travis with his teeth snapping, inches from his throat. Travis reacted on instinct, slamming the kid back with both hands, pinning him against the wall with a thud that shook dust loose from the rafters. Caleb's head lolled, but he kept growling, red eyes flickering, and Travis held him there, muscles burning, breath heaving. Above them, the roof exploded inward, tin tearing apart with a screech as the horde smashed through, claws ripping at the edges. A child's bloody hand dangled from the gap, small and pale, swinging limp as the shed filled with feral howls, loud enough to drown out everything else. Travis glanced up, heart pounding, and knew they were out of time. The shed was coming apart at the seams, walls buckling as zombies flooded every crack, their claws scraping wood into splinters. Travis crouched low, the gas can's fuse hissing in his hand, sparks spitting like tiny fireflies against the dark. The air stank of gasoline and rot, thick enough to choke on, and he flicked his lighter with a shaky thumb, the flame catching fast. Holly was a few feet away, dragging Caleb by the arm, his snarl ripping out of him now. A guttural, animal roar that didn't sound human anymore. His eyes blazed red, bright and wild, and she yanked him closer. Her voice breaking as she begged, "Fight it, Caleb, please! You're still in there, I know it!" But he twisted hard, breaking free with a jerk that sent her stumbling, and lunged at Travis, teeth snapping. Travis fired quick, the revolver barking in his hand, the shot grazing Caleb's arm, enough to knock him back into the dirt with a howl. Blood welled up, dark and sluggish, dripping from the wound as he writhed. Holly screamed, "Stop!" throwing herself in front of him, arms outstretched like she could shield him from the truth. Her face was a mess of tears and mud, her knife dangling useless at her side. Travis barely had time to curse before the gas can's fuse hit its mark. The explosion tore through the shed with a deafening boom, a fireball swallowing the zombies in a roar of heat and light. Wood and tin flew everywhere, flaming chunks raining down as the horde tumbled back, some still clawing through the blaze, their shrieks twisting into something unearthly. Travis grabbed Holly's arm, hauling her up from where she'd fallen, her leg still bleeding from that claw slash. "Move," he yelled, voice hoarse, dragging her toward the door, or what was left of it, as the shed caved in behind them. She stumbled, half resisting, her eyes locked on Caleb, who was crawling after them through the wreckage, blood dripping from his jaws, staining the dirt black. The wind hit them as they burst outside, howling like a mourner's wail, carrying ash and the faint crackle of the fire still burning behind. They staggered into the field, fog rolling in thick, a choking shroud that swallowed the world around them, turning every step into a blind gamble. Holly reached for Caleb again, her hands shaking as she clutched his arm. His flesh was cold now, clammy under her fingers, and he pulled away sharp, teeth bared, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. She froze, whispering, "Caleb, no," but before she could move, another shape rose from the fog, a figure clawing up from a split grave, mud caking its hands, dragging clumps of earth with it. Travis stopped dead, his breath catching as he saw her, his wife, Sarah, her burial dress tattered and soaked, hanging off her decayed frame. Her face was a snarling ruin, eyes glowing red, and she lurched toward him, hands outstretched like she remembered who he was. That's when it hit him, a truth colder than the fog. The storm hadn't just cracked graves open. It woken the town's dead, turned them into something worse. They weren't just hunting anything alive. They were hunting their own kind, driven by some primal hunger twisted up with the people they'd known, loved, buried. Caleb turned fully then, his growl peaking into a snarl as he lunged at Holly, teeth sinking into her throat with a wet, ripping sound. She roared, a raw, guttural sound, and in seconds, her eyes flared red, locking on Travis with a flicker of recognition. Not hate, but something softer, sicker, like a lover spotting him across a room. The field erupted around them, more graves splitting, figures rising through the mud, their twisted faces familiar in the worst way. Travis's brother, Jed, clawed up, his flannel shirt half-rotted, one eye dangling loose as he staggered forward. Holly's pa was there too, his diner apron shredded, hands reaching for her with a groan that sounded almost like her name. Travis fired his last shot, the revolver clicking empty after the bullet punched into Holly's chest. She barely flinched, just kept coming, Caleb at her side, and they tackled him together, teeth tearing into his flesh. He hit the ground hard, mud squelching under him, the pain sharp and hot as their jaws worked, ripping skin and muscle. The horde swarmed in, neighbors and kin closing the circle, old Mrs. Carter from down the road, her Sunday hat still pinned to her rotting scalp. The gas station kid, his acne-scarred face now peeling away. They dragged Travis down, claws sinking into his legs, his arms pulling him into the muck as he thrashed, his screams choking off into a gurgle. Holly and Caleb were on him still, their teeth relentless, and the last thing he saw was her red eyes staring into his, like she was sorry it had to end this way. The prairie swallowed their screams, the fog rolling thicker under a sky that didn't care, leaving nothing but the wind's mournful howl and the faint, fading crackle of that burning shed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.